Well, good morning. Well, at least it's morning here, and welcome to the final lecture on Aristotle's Ethics, Book 10. This is for the introductory ethics class at St. Vincent College. And we are just going through some of the basic ideas, certainly not covering everything, but just enough, as I've said in my other lectures, to give, hopefully a roadmap for us to understand some of the major ideas. And we're using, which I do consider to be the best translation, Martin Ostwald's translation of Aristotle's Ethics. As I usually do, I'd like to just make a comment on just placing Book 10 in a context that there's several themes that Aristotle focuses on, namely the nature of pleasure, and then he talks a good deal about, he revisits the question of happiness, and then finally starts talking about politics and ethics and lawmaking. And it seems, again, as we've already discovered, slightly disparate. We could find ourselves wondering, what is Aristotle doing? And again, as I've mentioned so many times before, there is a method to Aristotle's madness that he is ending, we might say, with the end. He's dealing with what is the nature of the end of activity? It is really one of the things that he wants to conclude with. In other words, he's sort of bringing around the discussion full circle, because at the beginning, what did Aristotle in fact write about or speak about? He wrote about the end. And for Aristotle, this has a very specific philosophical terminology, the final cause, that really in the sequence of things, the final cause is in some sense the first thing that you have to think of. Because in order to get somewhere, you first have to know where you're going in order to get there. So really the end, or the final cause, is what needs to be considered first. And so Aristotle is bringing us full circle to talking about the ends of particular activities. And of course, pleasure and happiness, those themes, as well as politics, which we'll see in a moment, play a pretty strong role in understanding the nature of the end of things. And so that's a little bit what we're going to be talking about this morning. And I would just like to start off, he does start off with some questions on which I'm going to glance over. He goes over a particular view, like, are pleasures evil, or is pleasure really the goal of life? And on the notion of whether or not pleasure is evil, of course, Aristotle always takes the mean. Aristotle says, well, yes and no. It depends on the kinds of pleasures that we're talking about. It depends on the kinds of pleasures, in fact, that are completing our activity. So his answer to the question, about whether or not pleasures of evil or are evil, well, they could be, but it depends on the activity. That all depends on the activity. On the question of, is the end of life, is the goal of life really pleasure? And I think that after reading 9 books of Aristotle, we could already answer that question. Of course it isn't. However, Aristotle does not have a negative view of pleasure. He thinks that the happy life, the truly happy life, does have numerous pleasures sprinkled throughout it, but the kind of pleasures are absolutely key. And so we're going to just take a few minutes to try to understand the nature of pleasure, because that's a rather confusing point, even if you're a PhD in philosophy. Because in order to put pleasure into a genus, and I'm not entirely certain, honestly, what it is. Now, I did not research this for long. I certainly read Aristotle, and I looked up a few things. And in a certain sense, a lot of people would want to say, well, it's a kind of emotion. And Aristotle said, no, that's not it. What Aristotle is going to say is that, and it's not really quite an activity either. So he, in his typical style, he goes through particular genuses. Well, is it this? No, not exactly. Well, is it this? That doesn't seem to be right either. But in the very least, what Aristotle wants to say is that pleasure is the completion of an activity. Pleasure is a completion of an activity. He uses this language of, that pleasure is a kind of whole, W-H-O-L-E, in itself, rather than a part of something. We could think of a number of different activities, and the example that Aristotle himself gives us is that, we have a certain power, namely vision. Of course, the soul has various powers. And when vision sees something, well, that action is complete. Its power has been filled with something. There is a certain coming to rest of the power of vision whenever it sees something. And that is whole and complete. So the pleasures, you see how it's hard to categorize this. It doesn't exactly seem like pleasure is an emotion, and it neither seems like pleasure is a kind of motion. Emotions are really kind of motions, as you can see in the similarity of those two words. And it's not exactly an activity. It's more a cessation of activity. That, even when we're doing something that we don't particularly enjoy. Like, I remember spending a summer putting roof tiles on I think maybe it was a library. I can't remember the kind of building. I was working with my father in construction. And this is in the South in the summer. So it was not a particularly fun activity. But when I stopped, but it certainly was. I mean, so even the activity itself that you're doing might not be a terribly pleasurable activity, but when it comes to a kind of completion, we can say that there is a bit of pleasure there. Something has come to rest. So this is really, when we come to the end of anything, this is including life itself. Why do you think that Christians have wonderful phrases like, eternal rest grant unto him, O Lord, and let perpetual light shine upon him, right? That's a saying, certainly we Catholics have it. Eternal rest. The activity of their life has come to a completion. It has come to rest. And where else is there to go when hopefully you are in the arms of God? That there's nowhere else to go. So that would be supreme rest. But of course, our life is made up of innumerable kinds of activities. We're constantly moving, coming to rest, moving, coming to rest, moving, coming to rest. And so we go in kind of seasons where this occurs to us. And so I think that is a very important point to understand about Aristotle. That pleasure is not a becoming, it's an arriving. It is a coming to rest. And it stands to reason, of course, Aristotle being the hierarchical thinker that he is, there is a ranking to these pleasures. There's always a hierarchy in Aristotle, right? There's the irrational part of the soul, and there's the rational part of the soul. And by book 10, which pleasures do you think are lower on the scale for Aristotle than which ones? You know which ones, of course. In our animal nature, many, if not most, of the pleasures that we have are irrational in the sense that they take part in very bodily functions, which is fine. I mean, you usually always see me with my coffee during these lectures. This is a very irrational pleasure, irrational in the sense of how often I drink it. But it's pleasurable. And it has to do with my bodily senses. And that's just fine, according to Aristotle. Now he would say, if I started drinking a few pots a day, and you saw my hand shake, that's getting to be a problem. But that is why, as we'll see in a moment, Aristotle ultimately talks about contemplation. Because guess what contemplation is? It is the ultimate coming to rest of the ultimate activity of the human being. And therefore has the ultimate pleasure. Now, do you see what I mean? Well, it's not really what I mean. No one cares what I mean. It's what Aristotle means. If he wants to identify the noblest activity, and it would stand to reason that the noblest activity would have the noblest pleasure. Well, the noblest activity should be related to what is noblest in the human. And what is noblest in the human being? But mind, wisdom, ultimate wisdom. And so, very logically speaking, then contemplation would be the highest level of activity for a human being. And that highest level of activity, what would come with it would be the highest level of pleasure, if we're in fact capable of experiencing it. Not necessarily everyone is. Like in our nature we are, but Aristotle probably would say it takes a good deal of training and discipline to actually be able to ascend to that level. It does. It doesn't necessarily mean you have to go to college. I've seen some incredibly contemplative individuals who were not college educated, who were quite capable of contemplation, but they trained themselves and they had discipline. That there was no difference with that. And I'm probably getting a little bit ahead of myself when I'm mentioning that, but it seems to be apropos. Now, what is the measure of whether a pleasure is good or bad? Aristotle speaks about this. And I've already introduced this, that pleasures differ in kind. But certain pleasures that we have, and this gets into the question of, well, are some pleasures bad? I mean, say even the pleasure of eating or drinking, which are necessary for life. Okay, but what happens when we're really trying to engage in something more noble? Let's say that this activity is maybe some kind of art, or art or study, just noble things. However, instead of these activities, instead of really carrying through with those activities, we get sidetracked by another pleasure. Even something like eating or drinking, we just become riveted on it. Or anything else, playing a computer game, talking on the phone with your mom, whatever it might end up being. And there are certain and more intense pleasures that they can rather easily sidetrack us from the noble ones. And this Aristotle sees as, well, very, very damaging. See, he even makes some, I think, rather, he can get comical in the Ethics from time to time. That, say you have an individual who really enjoys flute music. Okay, now this is ancient Greece, so that's kind of their version of listening to iTunes. Okay, they love, you have someone who really loves flute music, and you're trying to have a really deep conversation with them. But all of a sudden in the distance, they hear flute music and they hear their favorite song. Well, immediately, squirrel, okay, they're not paying attention to you anymore because they have been distracted, literally pulled away from, that's what distract means, from the nobler pleasure, the nobler activity, which was supposed to bring its own pleasure, but you want this other one instead. And so you didn't get this one. Now, I think that there's some beautiful lessons to be learned if we kind of even take a step beyond Aristotle and apply this. Because I've seen this happen in my own life and in the life of others. That, say, people start to take up a life of study, and they find, which is difficult, it's very difficult, and they find themselves often distracted. And they end up really not blaming their distractions, but they end up sometimes blaming the study. Well, that didn't work out for me, they say. I got distracted by this and that. Well, they didn't train themselves enough for the payoff of feeling the pleasure of the study. Some pleasures you have to work for. That's why the human being, that's why it's our nature to often go for the quick ones. Why we allow sometimes even pornographic things, why we allow food and drink to distract us so easily, because the payoff is fairly immediate and rather simple, but it's rather immediate for an animal as well. It's immediate for a cow and for a pig as well. And those are not my images, those are Aristotle's images, okay? It's not just me being snotty, okay? But some pleasures take more training and effort to experience. And I think that this is something that we would do well to remember. And Aristotle's theory helps us to understand that. I'm just kind of trying to apply it a little bit more. Pleasure is a wonderful thing for many reasons. It completes and it intensifies activity. Pleasure is a good thing. I mean, in the sense of, well, good heavens, why would you continue to do something if there wasn't some form of payoff, or at least some hope of payoff? You understand what I mean? Some form of pleasure. If you start to pick up classical guitar and all of a sudden you find that, you played a song and it really sounded good. And that feels good. And you should feel proud of yourself for taking the time to actually go, you know what, I nailed that. That was good. Whatever pleasure it might be. Even starting a new company, selling some of your first items, having people tell you that whatever you did was really impressive. Those things we experience pleasure from. And they are completions of activities. And what Aristotle is constantly reminding us about, though, are the pleasures really supporting your moral and your intellectual virtue? Are the pleasures really completing acts of virtue, or are they completing acts of vice? Which one is it? And we know which side by now he's on. Which side is this on? Because, do the wicked not have their pleasures? Absolutely they do. But Aristotle says, of course, that, well, they are wicked. They're ultimately destructive of the flourishing of human nature, truly so-called. So, is it bad to feel too much pleasure? I think that we've already answered that. Yes, it is. We know that. Too much pleasure can make us soft. I mean, if we make our lives, and Aristotle does say this, I'll relate this to this question. Can life be about rest and amusement? No, what a cheap life that would be, is what Aristotle is saying. He doesn't say that it exactly that way, but pretty close. That life should be about noble activity. Noble activity. Remember that quote that I read last class about, it would be preferable to do one great and noble act rather than years and years of mediocrity. And just imagine you're living from day to day, just seeking the maximum amount of pleasure, in the cheaper sense of that term, not in the nobler sense. What a life cheaply lived is what Aristotle would tell us. That, and the argument that he does give is, then what is all our hardship and suffering about? Is the goal, is the final cause of all of that nonsense we went through, and all of us go through it. We all have our tragedies, we all have our crosses, however you want to say it. And to go through all that and simply have cheaper pleasures as the goal of your life, that you paid in sweat and blood just to rest and feel pleasure, Yeah, I mean, Aristotle thinks that that's slavish, actually. That is the life fit for a slave or an animal. And that's not overstating it. That is what Aristotle says. So pleasures, a lot of people don't seem to understand this, that rather than being a goal, Aristotle does not want pleasure to be our goal. It's different to say that pleasure ends an activity. That's not the same thing. Okay, maybe I should be a little bit more clear about that. What our goal is the good. It's happiness, you know. Happiness being something noble. A life lived an intellectual life lived in accordance with virtue. That's the goal. Pleasure shouldn't be the goal, but pleasure does complete various different activities. But it shouldn't be our final destination. And pleasure, in other words, is a kind of byproduct of activity. Is a kind of byproduct of activity. With his very beautiful book, very tragic book that C.S. Lewis wrote called Surprised by Joy, where he recounts his faith struggle really with the death of his wife, who was very interestingly named Joy. I'm pretty sure that's true. That Christians, or anyone for that matter, who go about their life making joy their goal, making an emotion or a pleasure their goal, will never find it. That Surprised by Joy is the title of the book, which is very, very wise. What C.S. Lewis is saying, which I'm mentioning because it's very consistent with the theory here. C.S. Lewis is very well read in these people. Certainly he knew his Aristotle. Okay, that you aim for nobility. You aim for the good. You aim for a virtuous life. And as a byproduct of many of those various activities, you will be surprised by joy. It will just come. And unfortunately, it will fade. I'm sorry to burst your bubble. It goes in seasons, right? It comes and it surprises us with its beauty, with its wonder. And it really is almost a kind of divine feeling that's very, very difficult to describe, if not impossible. Some of our greatest poets have tried, and only the greatest ones have really touched the hem of what those beautiful emotions might mean. But it is a fact that we all go through a great deal of hardship and suffering. And because of that, Aristotle finds that it's really just simply a human argument that having pleasure as the goal of such a life, it being so difficult, would be far too cheap for the nobility of the human person. Far too cheap. So, retrace Aristotle. I have some questions here. Retrace Aristotle's argument about happiness. This is in chapter 6, and this is important. Remember, I've mentioned numerous times defining things. Aristotle is constantly defining things, placing them in their genus, and then trying to come up with their differentiae, right? Trying to come up with what makes them different from other members of their class. That is how we define things. And he wants to stop because he's talking about pleasure which is a kind of end. It's completion of an activity, remember? And happiness is really the end. Do you see how those two are related? Okay, so there's a reason why Aristotle's talking about this, because he wants to compare and contrast, and he wants to make sure we understand pleasure's not the end. It's, in a certain sense, an end among many ends, and that it could be bad if we choose the wrong activities. But he asked the question, is happiness a kind of characteristic or is it an activity? So again, Aristotle is stopping. I can almost see him just standing in front of his students going, you know, what is happiness anyways? Is it a characteristic or is it an activity? And just starting to discuss it. But it's certainly on point. And I think, and he definitely goes towards happiness as an activity, right? Happiness is an activity. Because a characteristic, let me put this here. This characteristic as opposed to, say, activity. A characteristic is something that we have. An activity, of course, is something that we do. Is happiness really a having or a doing? And Aristotle goes through a few arguments about that. He says happiness is an activity, much more than a characteristic, because otherwise you could sleep or experience massive misfortune and still have happiness if it were a characteristic. I mean, in a kind of way, remember we were talking about the difficulty of placing friendship in a genus. That friendship isn't something I exactly have as much as I might have the virtue of courage. Courage is something kind of, in a way, self-contained. And it's either characteristic of my activity or it's not. It has a kind of stability in me. Or hopefully it does, okay? But we don't have a friendship in quite the same way. That's not a characteristic that I have. That's something that I work on with someone else, is a friendship. Well, happiness is something that we work towards by choosing the proper activities and feeling the proper pleasures, moving towards the proper good. It's a doing thing. It's not a having thing. And it never ceases to amaze me, especially maybe around New Year's, and some people saying things, I'll say, well, do you have any New Year's resolutions? And I've heard, well, I'm really going to just work on being more happy this year. And it's just really great to know that some people don't know what goals are. Yeah. I can't just decide that in 2021 I'm going to feel happier. That makes no sense whatsoever. Now I can decide to pursue particular activities that give me particular pleasures, hopefully real joys, which is really kind of a noble pleasure, in which I'm working towards the good, and as a byproduct, I'm experiencing pleasure, happiness, joy, however you want to characterize it. But happiness is something very concrete. It starts somewhere and it goes somewhere. And the easiest thing, I mean, if as human beings, we more or less have three different activities: feeling, and doing, and thinking. And this is what cognitive behavioral therapy is based on. Of the three, which one is easiest to change? And overwhelmingly, it's activity. I can't just, even with thinking, I can't immediately change what I think about something. Sometimes that takes time. Emotions, good luck. Good luck with snapping your fingers and changing your emotions. That's even harder. Usually the emotions follow upon a change in thinking and a change in activity. And so Aristotle, and that, I think a lot of that theory are based on Aristotelian insights. So with that, we come to what activity causes the greatest happiness and why. And we will see, and as I've already set it up, that's contemplation. If you could pause for a moment. Now, contemplation as really the highest form of pleasure, or really the best candidate for the happy life. That is really what Aristotle is arguing for, at least theoretically. At least theoretically. And we'll try to track with his argument a little bit here. I've written a pretty bad diagram on the board, but I just want you to just be able to see a bit of a map. That, again, we have the irrational part of the soul, the rational part of the soul, which would really extend down to here. And I just, inside it, I wrote some slightly different activities. At the bottom, more of our animal life of emotion and sense. That's been consistent with everything we've studied. Then there's another level of activity that Aristotle discusses towards the end of the Ethics. The active life, it's often called. The life of art, the life of the military, the life of politics. These are definitely activities, and certainly should be activities in conformable to virtue, and certainly conformable to our higher nature. Aristotle would not disagree with that. But you remember when we studied the various intellectual virtues, what was at the absolute height? Remember that theoretical wisdom, that Sophia, philosophia, philosophy. It is at the absolute pinnacle of our rational life. It's up here, because it's up here from the highest of the heights. It is that form of us, or that part of us, that can order and direct and understand everything beneath it. So it would stand to reason, and this is Aristotle's reasoning, that if that is what is highest in us, then the virtue or activity associated with that highest part of us, should also bring the greatest pleasure and the greatest happiness. Now, theoretically, that seems fine. That's why it's theoretically. Aristotle does make exceptions, is the wrong word. He understands that there are various different characters, and that we are formed by both nature and convention. He mentions that very specifically in this chapter. So he's not saying that everybody should be up here. Aristotle is an aristocrat. Of course, he's not going to say that. He's living in a city with thousands and thousands of slaves, for goodness sakes. But theoretically speaking, is it the highest form of life? Yes. Now, in practice, hopefully I want to read a few of his words, which are very, very lucid, because sometimes he gets a bit opaque, but his discussion in this particular chapter is very clear. Now, if happiness is activity in conformity with virtue, it is to be expected that it should conform with the highest virtue, and that is the virtue of the best part of us, the top of that pyramid, right? Whether this is intelligence or something else, which it is thought by its very nature rules and guides us, and which gives us our notions of what is noble and divine, whether it is divine itself or the most divine thing in us, it is the activity of this part when operating in conformity with the excellence or virtue proper to it that will complete our happiness. Now, I think that he is also saying, by implication, that all of us participate in this highest part on differing levels. Okay, I mean, in other words, some people, this might be a bad way of putting it. Some people just like are smaller triangles, okay? And some larger, but they're still a triangle. And this should still be the ruling part of them. Even if they happen to be a slave, they could still govern their actions by what is most divine in them. That doesn't mean that they have to live in a college surrounded by shelves of books. Okay, I think that it's fair to say that. Now, Aristotle ideally is thinking about a kind of contemplative life in its purest form. He is thinking about the man or the woman that can be surrounded with scrolls, right? In ancient Greece, we don't surround ourselves as much with scrolls anymore, and I think we should. But truly trying to cultivate that highest part in us and making that the majority of their activity for the day. That is what Aristotle puts up as an ideal. But I think that he understands only a very few can reach that ideal. But he's still going to paint it for us so that we can understand the theory of what he's trying to say. Now, he goes on to just try to argue that. Let's try to understand some of his arguments. That the pursuit of wisdom is done for its own sake. Do you remember all of our arguments about friendship? A major part of those arguments is what is done for its own sake is superior to that which is done for the sake of something else. And when we apply it to friendship, if I want your company because your dad happens to own a boat, okay, now I'm from the deep south along the Gulf Coast. The guy whose dad had a boat was always popular, okay? Why is that? Pretty easy to understand. That's loving someone for the sake of something else. But we want our friends to really admire or want to be with us just for who we are, for our own sake. I mean, I've done married couples retreats numerous times and asked, I think sometimes I've gotten some of these poor husbands in trouble. I'll say, why did you marry her? And usually they and several times, and then start giving me a list of qualities. And I'm smiling and I'm thinking, you're blowing it big time. That's not what she wants to hear. Okay. Um, on a few occasions, the right answer has come out. I love her because she's Melanie, and I didn't want to live my life without her. Like, there you go. Correct answer, my friend. Okay. But that's saying exactly what I'm saying here is loving someone for their own sake. You know, I could read Aristotle for two different reasons, at least, right? I could do all of this study for at least two different reasons. Let's just say two for the sake of argument. I could read him because I just want to get smart so I can get a job and write some articles that make me possibly bring me money and give me a reputation for being very clever. What am I'm doing, I'm studying, I'm contemplating, I am contemplating, but not for its own sake. But I could read Aristotle or any number of great writers and thinkers because I just want to know. I want to know what the truth is. I want to know what reality is. I want to see what's beautiful. I want to experience what's good. And that is what Aristotle is talking about when he says contemplation. To love it for its own sake. Now that is a segue into his other argument, as some of the other noble professions, again, think that this is ancient Greece, but some of this hasn't changed a great deal. He mentions a few other candidates, namely military service. I think we could say artists or artisans, noble people that produce the things that we need, or just beautiful things. Military service, politics. I think I said military, politics as well, or just being a lawyer, governing, et cetera, et cetera. And he makes the argument that, okay, that's fine. Those professions are noble. They are done. They are performed with the rational part of our soul. But if you look at it, they're all really done for the sake of something else. That we do politics for the sake of organizing human life. We're in the military for the sake of victory. We're in art, or an artisan for the sake of producing particular items. Now, with that, and I'm still wondering about this one. If you're truly an artist, you can do your art for its own sake. Okay, but because I thought about that, I said, oh, hold on a second. I like to write poetry from time to time. No one's hardly even seen it. I do it for its own sake. I want to produce something, hopefully, that's beautiful. But there, I can imagine Aristotle responding to me, when you're doing art that way, it's contemplation. Okay, do you see? And I'm not 100% sure, but I'm pretty sure. that if Aristotle was sitting in the room, he might buy that, but it's an arguable point. Okay. So a lot of these other professions are done not for their own sake, but contemplation is done for its own sake. He also makes the point, contemplation there's a self-sufficiency about contemplation, that it's reliable and undisturbed. That in these other professions, other people can mess you up all the time, okay? Office workers, relying on people for materials, meetings, etc., etc. Just think of your own list. But if you're a contemplative, like sometimes being a monk, I took some of this so seriously that I'm wearing this. I did take a lot of these arguments quite seriously. That your life is more undisturbed and does not rely as much on the vicissitudes of other people's thoughts and emotions and activities. That's what Aristotle means about being self-reliant, or the word was self-sufficient. And that there is a certain peace and happiness to that. Now, he has just finished. We have to remember to balance this with Aristotle's pretty clear understanding that the truly happy man or woman, even if a contemplative, seems to still need friends. He who lives outside of the society is either a beast or a god. It's one of Aristotle's sayings, that even the ivory tower contemplative, well, wouldn't he or she still want to share some of those insights sometime with another human being capable of listening or interested, or just the beauty of seeing the example of another person who is acting virtuously? The contemplative needs to see that as well. Aristotle mentions that in some of these chants, that it is pleasant and good, even for the contemplative up here, to see others acting virtuously. That he needs that, but that is a good thing. And he does mention, which is a difficult thing, however, the necessities of life must be provided. Care of the body must be provided. He must have the necessities of life, Aristotle says. And that takes time. He knows that. You've got to stop. You've got to fix your food. You have to, you can get sick. There's any number of things that can happen. So that is a big what if. The last time I checked, being an ivory tower contemplative doesn't necessarily pay too much. You might have to join a monastery in order to get even a little bit of it done. And it's even hard for us because we do things like teach classes, right? Which is fine. I enjoy teaching classes. It provides me for, again, a reason and an audience, people to share contemplation with, which is very pleasant for me. So those are a couple of arguments that Aristotle makes. Now, I mentioned that I could do this sort of contemplation. I could read Aristotle or any other thinker with at least two motives in mind. And that is why Aristotle mentions the sophists at the end of this, towards the end of this chapter. We have to understand that at the time, Socrates, Plato, and Aristotle, in that order, because there's a little genealogy of teachers there, there was a group of individuals called the sophists. And without getting too complicated, they were teachers in their time, or kind of like lawyers. They were hired guns who were supposed to be clever. They could make arguments from either side of a case, either political or simply academic. Whether or not something was true did not much interest the sophists. What they were interested in was the money that they got and the reputation for cleverness that they received. And I am grossly generalizing, but the generalization is true. And one of the reasons why we have Socrates and Plato and Aristotle is because there arose a group of thinkers who said, no, there is such a thing as truth, and you are cheapening it. And we are going to seek out what that means. The true contemplative, not the hired hand. That's what Aristotle wanted to be. And so that's why he brings out the sophists. Is there a certain pleasure in sophistry? Yes, there is. In many of our law courts, in many of our legislatures, in our universities, there's still a great deal of sophistry going on. Sophistry as opposed to philosophy. Sophistry meaning a likeness, really kind of a likeness to wisdom. We could kind of define it that way, rather than a love of wisdom, philosophy. And the problem with, and the greatest evil, of course, is a person who really knows the truth, who's capable of being a philosopher. But guess what you can do if you know the truth? You can also manipulate it. And that's even worse. I mean, if you know how the human body works, you can really cause people a massive amount of pain. But you could also be a great doctor, right? And it's no difference with wisdom. If you truly know the truth, then you can truly manipulate the truth. But I think in our society, we have really, I think generally a different problem. We have lots of sophists because we have lost our faith that truth exists. We have lost our faith that there is, in fact, something to find out there that is true, that's beautiful, and that's good. And I think one of the reasons why we're here, and if I were to leave you with anything, I would hope that I could leave you with a desire to search for that truth, whatever that might be. But Aristotle does end with some beautiful things, which I think are absolutely worth mentioning, because he segues into this talk about politics and about training. And why might he do that? He's coming full circle that which science organizes how this pyramid might look, and it's politics. At least in his time, but I do think that it's a pretty decent argument in our time to say something very similar, especially as many of our governments seem to be centralizing, and a lot of power seems to be centralizing in very concentrated places, right? we're not living in a medieval world where there's hundreds and hundreds of little fiefdoms with different kings. We're living in a more global world where you have just a few incredibly powerful players, right? So power is centralizing. So it might be a very good idea to rethink and take very seriously how we're making our laws. And there's a few things that I did want to read because I do think they are worth reading. Now that we have given an adequate outline of these matters of the virtues and also of friendship and pleasure, can we regard our project as having reached its completion? Must we not rather abide by the maxim that in matters of action, the end is not to study and attain knowledge of the particular things to be done, but rather to do them? Even Aristotle, the great thinker, okay, and there's some irony here. He's saying the highest life is to be a contemplative, but what did he just say at the end of the book? Okay, that it's superior to do these things. I mean, of course, a contemplation is a doing. It is an activity. So he's not contradicting himself. But I do think there's a little irony involved there. So the practice is superior to the theory for Aristotle. And he makes the overwhelming point. Let me just read this. For the natural tendency, and he's talking about whether or not we can truly be possessed of virtue. For the natural tendency of most people is to be swayed not by a sense of shame, but by fear, and to refrain from acting basely, not because it is disgraceful, but because of the punishment that it brings. Living under the sway of emotion, they pursue their own proper pleasures and the means by which they can obtain them, and they avoid the pains that are opposed to them. But they do not even have a notion of what is truly noble and pleasant because they have never tasted it. What argument indeed can transform people like that? To change by argument what has been long ingrained in a character is impossible, or at least not easy. I mean, it might sound a tiny bit negative, but I really don't, my experience is that that's not far from the truth. It is possible because I've worked with some pretty rough characters, some addicts and criminals that have in fact reformed quite beautifully. So it is possible, but not without a great deal of training, discipline, and study, which is very consistent with what Aristotle is telling us. He continues, now, whatever goodness comes from nature is obviously not in our power, but is present in truly fortunate men as the result of some divine cause. Okay, he is saying what's present by what some people can do this. They were born to be able to do it. There are big triangles and small triangles and medium-sized triangles. Aristotle really very much is saying that in that passage. So I mean, I wasn't terribly far off. But listen to this. Argument and teaching, I am afraid, are not effective in all cases. The soul of the listener must first have been conditioned by habits to the right kind of likes and dislikes, just as land must be cultivated before it is able to foster a seed. Okay. So Aristotle never ceases to amaze me with his brilliance, and we haven't even touched on his metaphysical thought or his logical thought, which gets even deeper than this in many ways. But he is saying, you know, a lot of people argue with his understanding of virtue and the good, happiness as an end. And to quote him, he says, well, children often think that what they do is good as well. And that might sound super snotty in a way to us, but he's saying that these people simply have not been brought up with the proper sense of shame, the proper likes and dislikes, the proper appreciation for what is truly noble and good. And for such a person to really see this, as he says, is impossible or at least not easy. As a Christian, well, it's never impossible, but we also believe in grace, right? Which is a concept completely foreign to, of course, to Aristotle. So given that, why am I talking about that? Why is Aristotle talking about that? Then it stands to reason, if training is so important to this to understand everything that I just wrote on the board and everything that we've been studying all semester, to go back to his original political point, then it behooves him to study politics, which is the science that makes the laws, which forms the habits of everyone to be able to see this. That's why he talks about politics at the end, because he wants the proper, he wants the proper habits. But what makes the proper habits? Well, the right laws. The laws form the people, and then the habits are formed, and then the virtues can kick in, and it all begins to move, right? And hopefully, you know, it's a beautiful kind of circle. So, and this is how he ends, which is where we will end. And it's a point that I've mentioned before. And he's talking, first he mentions about studying legislation. And this is the final words of the ethics. Once we have studied this, the science of legislation, we shall perhaps also gain a more comprehensive view of the best form of constitution, of the way in which each is organized, and what laws and customs are current in each. So let us begin our discussion. That's the last sentence of the book. Let's get started, is what Aristotle says after the whole book. Isn't that fun? Okay. That the ethics is the prelude to the politics, the politeia in Greek. That you shouldn't touch legislation or politics without having a comprehensive understanding of why you are making the laws in the first place. That it shouldn't be for your own gain or some base need. It should be for the sake of the people, It should be to help them cultivate a life, an intellectual life in accordance with virtue. That is what our whole class has been about. And again, my final word is whatever truth you find, I hope that you at least believe that it's out there and you give everything that you have to search for it. Thank you for your time. It's been a pleasure.